The cargo shuttle smelled like engine grease and old metal. Dara Ose sat on a crate in the back, watching the stars through a cracked porthole. She had never left Earth before. She had never left Lagos before last week. Now she was watching a gas giant the size of her entire world grow larger in the window, and somewhere above it, orbiting in a slow and elegant circle, was the Vale Conclave Academy. She had one bag. It was old and patched in 3 places. She did not apologize for it. The docking bay was enormous. It could have fit her entire neighborhood inside it twice. Aliens stood in clusters near the entrance gates. Tall ones, short ones, ones with too many limbs and ones with no limbs at all. They moved with the easy confidence of people who belong somewhere. Dara stepped off the shuttle and felt every set of eyes in the bay find her at the same time. She had expected that. She walked anyway. The Vale Conclave Academy had existed for 900 years. It had trained the generals and scientists and diplomats who shaped the galaxy's history. It accepted students from over 200 species, all of them tested, ranked, and filtered through the most brutal academic evaluation process in known space. In 900 years, no human had ever been admitted. The acceptance letter had come to Dara 6 weeks ago, delivered by a government official who looked more nervous about it than she did. She found a registration desk. A Vale administrator, tall, gray-skinned, with 6 long fingers on each hand, looked at her entry form for a long moment. "Oh, say, Dara. Human." He said the word like he was reading a species name from a list of animals. First human enrollment in Academy history. Dormitory assignment, Block 7, Room 41. She picked up her bag and found Block 7 on the map. Room 41 was not designed for humans. That became clear within 30 seconds. The air had a sharp, metallic smell that made her eyes water. The temperature was wrong in a specific, deliberate way, about 10 degrees colder than comfortable, with a faint hiss from a vent in the corner that was pumping something into the air that was not quite oxygen. The room was designed for a solvent student, a species that breathed a nitrogen-heavy mix and preferred near-freezing temperatures. There was no solvent student in the room. There was just the room, the wrong air, and Dara. She set her bag down. She looked at the vent. She looked at the temperature controls on the wall, which were locked behind a panel that required a facility access code. She looked at the ventilation coupling, which was a standard galactic design she recognized from a maintenance manual she had read on the shuttle. She pulled a small multi-tool from her bag and got to work. 40 minutes later, the vent was recalibrated. The temperature was sitting at a reasonable level, and the air in room 41 smelled like air. She had not asked anyone for help. She had not reported the problem to the administration. She simply fixed it and moved on. The next morning, she found her class schedule slipped under the door. First period was combat theory with instructor Haven. She arrived 2 minutes early and sat near the middle of the room. Haven was a Vale male, broad-shouldered for his species, with a reputation Dara had read about in the academy file she had studied before arriving. Decorated, smart, not particularly interested in being kind. He walked in, looked at the room, and stopped when his eyes reached her. "Ah," he said, "the human." He let that sit in the air. Then he turned to the rest of the class and began his lecture on combat theory fundamentals, response time, physiological threat assessment, species-specific combat advantages. He used her as an example 3 times in the first 20 minutes. Humans, he explained without looking at her, were fragile. High emotional interference. Poor regulation under extended stress. Adapted for a single planet with relatively low environmental pressure. Interesting as a curiosity, but not well suited to the demands of this institution. Nobody in the room objected. A few students glanced at her. Dara wrote everything down. Not just Haven's words, everything. The layout of the room, the seating patterns of other students, which ones had looked at her with open contempt and which ones had looked away too quickly. She noted which students sat near the exits. She noted that the student 2 rows to her left, a small pale creature she didn't recognize the species of, had been tapping the same anxious rhythm on the desk since she walked in. She noted all of it and said nothing. After class, she walked back toward the dormitory block and past a group of senior students standing near the corridor junction. They were talking loudly enough that she was clearly meant to hear it. They were taking bets, not subtle ones. The question on the table was how many days before the human student requested a transfer back to Earth. The current leading guess was 11 days. One student said 5. Another said 3 and laughed. Dara paused just long enough to hear the numbers. Then she continued walking. She got back to her room, sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, and looked at the vent she had fixed the night before. 11 days. 5 days. 3 days. She pulled out her notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Then she started reviewing tomorrow's class material. She was going to need more pages. The food hall was on the 3rd level of the main building, a wide open space with high ceilings and long rows of dispensing stations designed for every dietary requirement in a 200-species institution. There was a human dietary setting. Dara found it on her second day. The tea dispense a gray paste. She stood there and looked at it for a moment. Then she tasted a small amount. It had the nutritional profile of a complete human meal and the flavor of absolutely nothing. She ate all of it. She came back for more. She told herself it was fuel and moved on. The gravity in the main training wing was calibrated for the average mass and bone density of Vale students. For Dara, it was manageable. Humans had denser bones than most species the Academy regularly accepted, and the lower districts of Lagos megacity had not been gentle on the body. She ached every night for the first week. She stretched every morning for 30 minutes and said nothing about it to anyone. The social architecture of the Academy was the harder thing to navigate. There were alliances here built over years, hierarchies tied to home species and political weight in the conclave. Humans had no political weight. Humans had no history here. Dara moved through the common areas like furniture, present, noticed briefly, then ignored. The worst part was not the act of hostility. It was the thoughtless kind, the kind where she would walk into a room and the conversation would simply continue as if she had not entered, because she was not interesting enough to register. She was mapping all of it. Quietly, the small pale creature from Combat Theory found her on the 3rd day. His name was Rovi. He was Fincy, a species from a minor trade world, small population, small political footprint, no military tradition. He was the only Fincy at the Academy, had arrived 2 years before she did, and had spent most of that time being treated in precisely the way Dara was being treated now. Except he had nobody to compare notes with until he sat down next to her in the food hall without asking permission. He looked at her gray paste. He looked at his own bowl, which was a different kind of gray paste. Then he looked at her. "How are you still here?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Where would I go?" she said. He nodded like that answer made complete sense. After that, they ate together every day. Rovi knew the Academy's unspoken rules, the ones that were never written down and never taught, but that got you quietly destroyed if you broke them. He told her which faculty members reported back to the Vale political bloc. He told her which common areas were informally reserved for which species groups after certain hours. He told her how the senior student ranking system actually worked, which was different from how the official documentation said it worked. She listened carefully. She took mental notes that, in return, she taught him something the Fancy had no cultural framework for: deliberate misdirection. Rovi species communicated with a transparency that was almost physical. They found dishonesty deeply uncomfortable and were consequently very bad at it. Dara spent several evenings teaching him how to give technically true answers that communicated completely wrong impressions. He found this both useful and unsettling, like learning to walk with a new set of legs. The first formal academic evaluation came in the 3rd week. Instructor Haven handed Dara a test packet that was noticeably thinner than the ones given to the rest of the class. She looked at it. She looked at him. He met her eyes with an expression that said he was waiting for a reaction, for embarrassment or protest, or the kind of wounded dignity he could dismiss. She opened the packet and completed it in 12 minutes. She set it face down on the desk and sat quietly. Haven glanced at the time. Something moved across his face. He walked over, picked up her packet, looked at the first page, then looked at her. The rest of the class still had 40 minutes left on the standard exam. "You want the real one?" he said. His tone made it sound like a joke, like he was giving her enough rope. "Please," she said, that he brought the full evaluation. She finished with 7 minutes to spare and answered the optional advanced questions at the end because she had the time. She scored in the top 4 of the class. Nobody congratulated her. The student who had bet 3 days told the student who had bet 11 days something quietly, and the 11-day student looked uncomfortable. The betting pool grew larger. She knew this because Rovi told her, because Rovi had started tracking it as a way to practice the misdirection skills she had taught him. She found out her own name was on the list, not as someone betting, but as the subject. There was now a formal side wager on whether she would complete the first trial, which was the Academy's bruising solo survival simulation given to all first-year students. The general consensus was no. First years rarely finished it. No first year from a minor or newly admitted species had ever finished it. The notification that she had been officially entered into the first trial arrived that evening. Rovi brought it to her in person because he had been practicing looking calm while delivering bad news, and he wanted the practice. She read it once and set it aside. "Are you scared?" Rovi asked. "I've been in scarier places," she said. "I grew up in one." He did not fully understand what she meant. He filed it away anyway. The drop pod smelled like recycled air, somebody else's fear. Dara sat in the single seat, her pack on her knees, and watched the altimeter count down. No weapons were permitted. No communicatis. No guidance beyond a set of objectives printed on a card she had already memorized and folded into her front pocket. The simulation world was a fabricated environment inside one of the Academy's large orbital platforms, a constructed landmass about 40 kilometers across, with real terrain, real weather systems, real biological hazards imported from various worlds. The objectives were survive for 72 hours, reach 3 marked locations, and return to the extraction point. Students could tap out at any time by pressing a beacon on their wrist. Tapping out was logged permanently in the academic record. The pod hit the ground hard, and the hatch blew open. She was in a forest. The trees were wrong, too tall, with wide flat leaves the color of old copper. The light came from above through gaps in the canopy in pale blue shafts. The air was breathable, slightly humid. She spent the first 4 minutes completely still, just listening. Birds, or something like birds. Wind moving west to northwest, based on how the leaves were turning. Water somewhere to the south. She could smell it before she heard it. The ground under her feet was loose on the surface, packed firm about 4 centimeters down. She could use that. She moved in the lower districts of Lagos megacity. You learn to read a place before you move through it. You learn to tell the difference between structural sounds and animal sounds, between water that was safe and water that ran near old infrastructure and carried things you did not want to drink. You learn to sleep in pieces, 20 minutes here, 30 minutes there, because sleeping for too long in the wrong place was how you did not wake up. The Academy's monitoring systems were not built to track that kind of sleep pattern. They were calibrated for full rest cycles. 3 times over the first 20 hours, the system logged her as inactive and adjusted its alert thresholds. 3 times she was already up and moving again before any flag was raised. She found water in the first 2 hours. She purified it using a heat method she had learned from necessity rather than training. She found shelter in the 3rd hour, not a cave, but a dense overhang of roots where the ground was dry and the copper leaf canopy blocked the thermal signature from above. She noted it as a base and moved on to find the first marked location. She found it in 9 hours. The fastest previous time for a first year was 16th. She was at the second marked location by hour 22 when she found Graff. He was sitting against a boulder, favoring his right leg, trying to set a makeshift splint with hands that were slightly too large to handle the small pieces he was working with. He was Davari. The species was tall, wide, and built in a way that suggested evolution had decided that looking dangerous was more important than looking approachable. He looked up when she stepped into the clearing. He looked at her with an expression that made his feelings about being seen in this condition very clear. "I don't need help," he said. She looked at his leg. The angle was not good. "Yes, you do," she said, and set her pack down. He argued for 4 minutes. She let him argue and used the time to assess the injury. Soft tissue, not bone, but the swelling would lock the joint if it wasn't handled correctly within the next couple of hours. She had reset joints before, not in a simulation. In a stairwell in Block 12 of her home district, when her neighbor's kid had fallen from a fire ladder and there were no medics close enough to matter, she fixed his leg. He did not say thank you. His jaw was clenched so hard she could see the muscle working. She wrapped the joint properly, gave him 2 hours of rest instructions he immediately ignored, and left. She reached the third marked location at hour 51. She reached the extraction point at hour 71 and 40 minutes. She walked in with 19 minutes to spare, sat down on a flat rock near the extraction marker, and ate the last of her rations. The monitoring team watching the feed had not spoken for the last 6 hours. One of them had pulled up the historical completion data 4 times to check it against what they were seeing. She pressed the return beacon. The pod arrived. She got in. Back at the academy, a debrief technician met her at the landing pad with a medical scanner and an expression he was working hard to keep neutral. "You completed all 3 objectives," he said. "Yes." "In 71 hours and 40 minutes. "Yes." He noted something on his pad. "First year record," he said, almost quietly. "Previous record was 31 hours for a completion attempt. You're the first year to actually finish." She nodded. She was very tired and very hungry, and she wanted a shower. "The monitoring team also noted you made contact with another student. Graf, Davari. Right leg injury, South Quadrant, hour 22. He's probably still out there refusing to tap out." The technician checked his screen. His expression shifted slightly. "He tapped out 40 minutes after you left him. He's already back." She picked up her bag. "Good." In the faculty records, her name went to the top of the first-year completion list. In the common areas, the betting pool on her failure went very quiet. Nobody officially closed it. They just stopped adding to it. Commander Vell read the monitoring report that evening and read it twice. Commander Vell's office was on the top level of the tactical building, with a long window that looked out over the orbital platform's exterior hull, and beyond it, the dark. She did not have decorations on the walls. She had maps, data overlays, and a framed list of names that Dara guessed, from the formatting, were people who had died in operations Vell had commanded. Vell herself was older than most of the faculty, gray at the edges, with the kind of posture that never fully relaxed. She had been studying Dara since she sat down, in the straightforward way of someone who did not feel the need to pretend she wasn't doing it. "You've been here 6 weeks, Vell said. "Tell me what you've learned." Dara thought about the polite answer. She said aside, "That the Academy has 2 groups who are paying attention to me now. The first group wants to prove I don't belong here. The second group wants to use me as a symbol of something. Neither of them is actually interested in me." Vell looked at her for a moment. "Correct. What do you plan to do about it?" "Nothing. Let them project whatever they want. Keep working." Vell nodded once. "Good. Because both groups would try to pull you off course. The first with hostility. The second with flattery. Flattery is the more dangerous one." She leaned back slightly. "I requested this meeting because your first trial performance was notable. Not because I intend to mentor you or protect you. I want to be clear about that. The Academy does not run on kindness." "I know," Dara said. "I didn't come here for kindness." "Where did you come from, exactly?" "I read Lagos Megacity in your file. I know what that means in general terms. Lower District, Block 12. High-density residential, poor infrastructure, irregular services. High competition for resources. The kind of place where you either get good at reading situations fast or you don't do well." Vell was quiet for a moment. "And that's where you developed the pattern recognition we saw in the simulation. That and other things." Dara met her eyes steadily. "I'm not unique in what I can do. There are people from where I grew up who would make excellent students here. They just don't have the paperwork." That sat in the room for a second. Vell did not respond to it directly. She dismissed Dara shortly after with nothing warmer than a nod. But Dara had the feeling that the point had landed somewhere. The weeks after that were, academically, the best of her time at the Academy so far. Crisis strategy came naturally. The theoretical framework the Academy used was built on Veil military logic, which was rigid and elegant and worked well when all variables were known. Dara was good at it because she had learned the framework, and better at it because she had also learned what happened when the framework failed and you had to make decisions in the gap between 1 second and the next. xenobiology application, understanding how different species biology affected tactical and medical decisions, was a class she found most genuinely interesting. She spent extra time in the lab. The instructor noticed and started setting her harder problems without commenting on it. Improvised engineering she did not need to study. She had been doing it since she was 9 years old. Grath started appearing near her. He did not explain himself. He did not apologize for the way he had spoken to her in the forest. He simply began showing up in the places she was: the food hall, the library level, the corridor outside her second period class. He was large enough that his presence functioned as a kind of weather system, and people who had been considering saying something dismissive to Dara would look at Grath standing nearby and reconsider. He was paying a debt. She understood that. She did not embarrass him by saying so. Rovi found this development fascinating from a sociological perspective and asked Dara to explain the Davari honor debt concept 3 times before he felt he understood it. Then he asked why Grath seemed more uncomfortable with being thanked than with anything else. She told him that some cultures built their identity around self-sufficiency, and that needing help felt like damage to that identity. Rovi found this sad. Dara told him it was just a different way of being, and moved on. The formal challenge came on a Thursday, but a senior student named Oren Vale, top of the second-year rankings, politically connected in ways that Rovi had flagged weeks ago, filed a formal academic duel request. The challenge was a legal tradition, a senior's right to question a junior's enrollment merit through open academic competition. It was rarely used. When it was used to humiliate someone publicly. It was entirely aimed at her. Everyone knew it. The faculty knew it. The administration logged it and approved it without comment because the tradition was technically valid. Dara was notified via the standard academic messaging system. She accepted within 4 minutes of receiving it. Rovi saw the acceptance notification and went pale in the specific way Fincy went pale, which involved his secondary skin pigment shifting slightly green. Grath, when told, said nothing. He turned and walked away. An hour later, he came back sharpening the edge of a training blade he was not currently required to sharpen. Dara opened her xenobiology notes and kept studying. She was not worried. She had been in rooms where people wanted her to fail before. The only difference here was the room was bigger and the stakes were academic. She had always been better in slow-burn danger than the fast kind. Oren wanted a spectacle. She would give him one, just not the kind he was expecting. The academic duel hall was a room that did not get used often. The floor was clean, the lighting even, and the seating was filled in a way that made it clear word had spread. Students and faculty stood in clusters. The judge panel sat at the formal table. Instructor Haven was there, expression unreadable. Oren stood on one side of the floor, looking exactly like someone who had already decided how this ended. He was older by 2 years, top of his cohort, backed by a political family that had sent students here for 4 generations. He had prepared extensively, the specific kind of confidence that comes from preparation, though with him it was hard to separate that from arrogance. Dara stood on the other side. She had slept well. She had eaten her gray paste. She had her notebook in her bag, though she was not allowed to use it. The format was 3 rounds, scored by the judge panel. First, theoretical knowledge. Second, a live field simulation. Third, open-form problem solving. 2 out of 3 rounds won the duel. The first round was a verbal examination, questions posed by the judge panel, each student answering in turn. Oren was, as expected, flawless. He had the Academy's entire theoretical framework in his head in the way that top students did. Clean, organized, fast on recall. The room watched him the way rooms watch people who were good at things. Dara matched him. Question by question, she matched him, not just correctly, but with depth that came from a different place than textbooks. She answered a question on stress physiology under combat conditions in more detail than the standard curriculum covered, drawing on what she had seen in real environments rather than studied ones. Haven wrote something on his pad. Then a judge asked a question about human-specific neurological response patterns under threat conditions. It was in the curriculum only as a footnote, a minor species note. The question was almost certainly meant to catch her off guard in what should have been her own subject area. She answered it for 4 full minutes without stopping. She covered the base science, the environmental factors that shaped human response, the ways those factors overlapped with and diverged from the galactic standard models the Academy used. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment before the judges moved on. Round 1 ended as a tie. The judges did not look surprised. Oren did. The second round was a simulation run in one of the Academy's live scenario chambers. The scenario was a compound failure, multiple systems breaking down simultaneously in a command environment, requiring rapid prioritization and delegation. It was a test designed for Vale cognitive style, which was methodical and excelled at layered system management. Oren ran it beautifully. He prioritized correctly, delegated clearly, resolved 3 of the 4 failures within the optimal window. His time was good. The room was impressed. Dara's scenario loaded. She looked at it for about 15 seconds. Then she ignored the conventional prioritization model completely. She identified the one failure that, if resolved first, made the other 3 significantly easier to manage. Not the highest-rated failure by standard threat assessment, but the structural one that was feeding instability into everything else. It was not in the textbook. It was the kind of thing you saw if you had experience watching one small problem collapse into a larger one and learn to find a root before the branches fell. She finished in just over half of Oren's time. The judge panel conferred for slightly longer than usual before logging the score. Dara won round 2. Oren's expression did not break. He was better at that than most people would have been in his position. The third round was an open problem, a scenario presented to both students simultaneously, requiring a written solution submitted to the judges. It was designed for Vale reasoning patterns, and nobody had pretended otherwise. Dara read it and did not write anything for 4 minutes. The room got very still. Rovi, sitting in the back row, was doing the breathing exercise she had taught him for high-stress situations. Grath was standing near the wall with his arms crossed. Looking at the ceiling, at the 4-minute mark, she started writing. She wrote steadily for 12 minutes and submitted. Oren had submitted at the 8-minute mark. The judges reviewed both answers. The head judge, a senior Vale academic named Prell who had been at the Academy for 30 years, read Dara's submission twice. He said nothing out loud, but he underlined 2 sections and wrote a note in the margin that nobody else could see. The results were announced plainly. Dara had won 2 of 3 rounds. The duel was resolved in her favor. The room did not react loudly. It absorbed the result. Oren stood straight, gave the formal acknowledgement that the tradition required, and left. His friends left with him. The space they vacated felt different in some way that was hard to name. Later, the student who had organized the original betting pool quietly transferred the funds to the off-world student support program. No announcement. Nobody asked him to explain. Dara packed her notebook in her bag and walked out. Rovi caught up to her in the corridor and walked beside her without saying anything, which was his way of saying quite a lot. Grath appeared from somewhere behind them and matched pace, looking elsewhere. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired in a way that was close to satisfied. And then the alert came. A real one. A research station in the outer system had gone dark, and the Academy was dispatching its students for a live extraction exercise. Her name was on the list. The briefing was short. A research station called Outpost 7 had gone silent 4 hours ago. It sat in the debris field at the edge of the Sephiron system, thick with old rock and dead satellites. Navigation hazardous, communication unreliable. 6 researchers were confirmed inside when contact was lost. Life support status was unknown. The Academy was sending its advanced students as a live conditions extraction exercise. Dara was the youngest on the roster by 2 years. The shuttle ride out took 40 minutes. The other students talked through the approach in the way of people running a training scenario, measured, analytical, unhurried. Dara sat near the window and watched the debris field grow in the glass. She was thinking about the researchers, not the scenario. The researchers. They docked at the station's emergency port. The main hatch was sealed from a power failure. Dara had it open in 6 minutes using a bypass technique she had learned from a broken door in Block 12 of her home district, updated for the different panel design. The station inside was dim, cold, and listing slightly. One of the stabilizer anchors had failed, causing a slow tilt that was not dangerous yet, but would be in another 3 hours. 2 of the 6 life support zones were offline. The researchers had consolidated in Zone 3, the largest section, where air was still circulating. The senior students fanned out to assess. Their movements were clean and competent and paced for a training exercise. Dara was already moving faster. She had the layout of the station memorized from the technical schematic included in the briefing packet, the one that most students had glanced at and filed away. She moved through the dark corridors with the assurance of someone who had navigated worse in less light. She found the main stabilizer control room, assessed the failed anchor in 4 minutes, and started the manual override sequence. The procedure required 2 people to complete simultaneously from panels on opposite sides of the room. Grath appeared in the doorway. She did not ask how he had followed her so quickly through the dark. She pointed at the second panel. He crossed the room and put his hands on it without a word. They stabilized the station together in 11 minutes. The tilt stopped. In Zone 3. The 6 researchers were frightened and cold but unhurt. 3 species, 6 individuals, different physiological needs. Dara moved through the space quickly, assessing each one. The Veil researcher with hypothermia symptoms, the 2 fancy researchers who needed the air mixture adjusted, the human botanist who had a hairline fracture in her wrist from a fall and hadn't mentioned it because she didn't want to be a problem. Dara found a wrist injury by watching how the woman held herself. She splinted it with equipment from the station's emergency kit in 4 minutes. Rovi appeared from somewhere near the rear of the zone. He had, somehow, boarded the shuttle without being on the manifest. His explanation for this was technically true and communicated a completely wrong impression of what had happened, which was evidence that he had been practicing. He found a communications relay panel, assessed it, and began patching it back to full function using the improvised repair method Dara had taught him 3 weeks earlier. The relay came back online. They had comms. The senior students arrived at Zone 3 12 minutes after Dara. They found the researchers stabilized, the station no longer tilting, and communications restored. One of them stood in the doorway for a moment and said nothing. Nobody had assigned Dara leadership. She had not announced any decisions or asked for authority. She had simply looked at a real situation with real people at the end of it and moved at the speed the situation required. The extraction took 90 minutes total. All 6 researchers were loaded onto the shuttle safely. An elderly Veil scientist named Dr. Sorith, the lead researcher, the one with hypothermia symptoms that Dara had wrapped in emergency insulation and sat next to until his core temperature stabilized, looked at her in the shuttle on the way back. He had been watching her since Zone 3. Not in the way people had been watching her since she arrived at the academy. Differently. You trained somewhere difficult, he said. It was not a question. Lagos megacity, she said. Earth. Lower district. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands, then back at her. We should have invited your species sooner, he said. Much sooner. She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. She looked out the window at the debris field passing behind them. The academy, docking bay. Commander Vell was waiting at the ramp. She stood straight in the way she always stood straight, and she watched the researchers come off first, then the senior students, then Dara, then Rovi, who received a separate and specific look from Vell that he bore with admirable composure. Vell looked at Dara for a long moment. Then she said, "Good." From Vell, it was a speech. That night, Dara sat alone on the observation deck above the dormitory block. The gas giant filled the lower half of the window, slow and enormous and indifferent. Rovi came and sat beside her after a while. Grath stood a few meters away, technically there for other reasons, technically looking at something else. She had stopped counting the days sometime in the first week. She couldn't remember exactly when. The counting had assumed she was waiting for something to end, and somewhere between the gray paste, the vent she fixed, the forest, the duel, and the 6 researchers, that had stopped being true. The most prestigious academy in space had welcomed her. It had taken them until now to understand what that actually meant.